Good evening and welcome to tonight's Lockdown Learning. My name is Bren Carlil and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. Tonight we are having a panel of young Australians who will be discussing how their Jewish identity shapes their perceptions of the world around us. Now, this panel, while not representing anyone, is representative of the next generation of the Australian Jewish community, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Before I hand you over to the panel, in fact, before I introduce them, I just want to tell you about next week. At the normal time of 8 p.m, I'll be speaking with Zeddy Lawrence, who is the editor of the Australian Jewish News. So tonight's panel consists of Chaya Herszberg, who is a former chair of the Australasian Zionist Youth Council, and she already has a BA and is studying law at Melbourne University. Chaya studied at Midreshet Lindenbaum in 2016 before becoming involved in B'nai Akiva. Daniel Elberg is the Public Affairs Coordinator for byAUJS. He's also an advisor to the Federal Liberal MP Tim Wilson and studies arts law at Monash University. Jess Harrison is studying global development and Indigenous studies, as well as sculpture and printmaking. She is a member of the progressive Jewish community in North Shore Temple Emmanuel in Sydney. She served as NETS's federal chairperson and has also worked for the Asylum Seekers Centre. Jess is now working as a community organiser for the Sydney Alliance, where she's involved in its campaign Voices for Power. The campaign aims for migrant communities, mainly across Western Sydney, to lead work in achieving affordable and sustainable energy for all. Now, tonight's panel will be moderated by byAUJS President Josh Kirsh. Josh is a deputy at the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies and is midway through an arts law degree at Sydney University, where he's majoring in international relations and women's and gender studies. So with no further ado, I will hand you over to Josh.
Thanks, Bren. And I just want to also thank the ZFA for bringing this wonderful group together for this discussion. I'm looking forward to having the chat with the three of you tonight. I just want to also take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we all gather on today, separately, of course. I'm joining you from the lands of the Bedegal people of the Eora Nation. Daniel joins us from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Jess joins us from the lands of the Gadigal Wongal people. And Chaya joins us from the lands of the Gunnar Kurnai people. And we pay our respects to elders of those lands, past, present, and emerging. The acknowledgement of country leads us to a pretty natural starting point for the discussion, which is at the moment, so many questions are swirling around about race, privilege, and ethnicity, when we're, of course, not talking about global pandemics. But in that context, it's worth asking, do you think Jewish people of Ashkenazi heritage should identify as white or not? Who'd like to start us off? Don't all jump at once.
Yeah, I'm happy to start if you're happy for me to start.
Would love it.
I think the first thing that comes to my mind with this type of question is that Jewish people are white for people who, I guess, want to argue that Jewish people aren't discriminated against, and they're not white for people who want to discriminate against Jewish people. And I think that's an important point to note. However, it's also somewhat semantic, because I think the implication of kind of arguing whether Jews are white or not white or whatever, I think the underlying implication there is that Jews just don't face discrimination if they are considered white, or they do especially because they are not white. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, Jews, like any other minority group, face discrimination in their own unique way. So I think kind of labeling the discussion as whether Jews are white or not white is almost a little bit reductionist and kind of doesn't notice the unique ways in which Jews have to face discrimination in various ways. Various ways in various different contexts as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. Again, the conversation about whiteness is so complex. So I'm again like really excited that excited is a weird turn of phrase. I'm interested to hear what everyone's thoughts are. I can speak for myself. Everyone has multiple identities, and I can say that, you know, as a woman, I've experienced sexism in a lot of different ways. I've experienced anti-Semitism I've experienced homophobia, ageism. Like, we've all experienced discrimination because of certain parts of our identities. And it feels awful. It makes us feel powerless, makes us feel angry. But at the same time, I also have other parts of my identity which hold a lot of privilege. I'm a white person, and I feel that way because I've never experienced racism. I've never been denied an opportunity or made to feel unsafe because of my race, because of the color of my skin. So in that way, my whiteness is very privileged. You know, I also grew up on the North Shore of Sydney. That's another very privileged part of myself. And something which I have to do, and I think a lot of people on this call do, is reconcile the fact that we're very complex people. We have different aspects to our identities. Some of our identity is marginalized, it is discriminated against, like our Jewishness. We are a cultural minority in this country, but we also hold a lot of privilege in some ways. Some of us live in very lovely suburbs in suburban Melbourne and Sydney, and some of us are white. Some Ashkenazi Jewish people are white, and we just need to learn to hold those contradictions. And more importantly, I think whatever identity we have, whatever we call ourselves, we all have a responsibility to fight racism. That's really the main point of this conversation. No matter what the outcome of this question is, are we white? How do we identify? The work that we do to fight racism should never change.
Yeah, so I would like echo some of the things that both of you said, and especially in terms of kind of how complex our whiteness is if we are white. And yeah, I agree that that kind of distinction between white and people of color is not necessarily helpful in all contexts. Like, anti-Semitism can still be a legitimate thing and we're white. But then, yeah, some of the other discrimination that people of color face, you know, such as implicit bias, some of us face and some of us don't face. I mean, my name's Chaya. I can imagine that maybe people will be bothered by a name that's not so Anglo sounding. Maybe not, maybe it's, you know, maybe the color of my skin kind of will just always help me out. But yeah, I think that there's a limit to how much we should harp on who's white and who's not white. And something that just came to my mind is last year I had this teacher or 2 years ago for multilingual poetry. And she kind of just said, like, at some point, obviously there's discrimination and there's the problems of racism that we need to face and we need to grapple with and we need to be activists for. But at some point, whiteness is not an identity, it's a non-identity. So if you relate to any other language, you know, I'm only fluent in English, but I have a strong cultural relationship with Yiddish and Hebrew. You know, my family's culture is anything but Anglo in a traditional sense. So it's like, and everyone will have that same story. Everyone has their own kind of identity, their own language, their own background and heritage. And so at some point, it's kind of a choice to define yourself as white. And it's also giving into this like melting pot old way of thinking that we have to give up our culture and like all assimilate into each other. So yeah, it's not just about the color of our skin, but at some point it is about the color of our skin. And it's good to kind of know when to talk about that and know when to stop talking about that.
It's an interesting question in terms of, I think I read somewhere recently a long discussion about the conflation between ethnicity and race, and how you can be a light-skinned person, you can be a person who doesn't necessarily identify as of color, but still face discrimination on the basis of your ethnicity. It's a big question, is Judaism an ethnicity or a religion, considering, you know, conversion is possible? Does anyone have an opinion on that question?
Yeah, and especially because, I mean, the premise of this question is, are Ashkenazi Jews white? And I mean, there's Ashkenazi Jews and there's Sephardi Jews, but then there's like a whole range of Jews. There's Japanese Jews. And so people are discriminated against on the basis of their nationality, on the basis of their ethnicity, on the basis of their abilities. So yeah, it's helpful to wonder how much we're discriminated against for being Jewish, and how privileged we are for being Jewish. But at the end of the day, my Jewishness and someone else's Jewishness from Ethiopia is going to look completely different. And yeah, I know we're talking about Ashkenazi Jews, but like, come on, it's not just Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews at the end of the day. So
yeah, it makes me think of, you know, I also think like the Ashkenazi Jewish community can be racist. There is racist within the Jewish community towards other Jewish people. Like I have a friend in South Africa who's a Black Jewish woman, and that she tells a story of a time where she rocked up in her official youth movement chutzah to the synagogue that she grew up in her whole life, and was refused entry by staff and by security. And yeah, like that story just like it breaks my heart. And yeah, Chaya, like I really agree with everything you're saying, and like culture and linguistics and ethnicity, it's so complicated. And yeah, I think it's an important caveat to know that when we talk about race and ethnicity in Judaism, let's look a little bit inward as well and know that like we can do better even like within our synagogue walls towards each other.
Did you want to add anything, Daniel?
No, look, I mean, the way I always understood it, really, just to go back to your original question, is that Jews are a people or a nation, and I think it kind of eschews those labels that we try and put on it. But I guess we also have to be conscious that we're kind of fixated, everyone generally, on labels and putting everyone into boxes. And a lot of people don't neatly fit into boxes. A lot of groups don't neatly fit into boxes. And we have to reconcile that not everyone will fit into those boxes. So Judaism's quite unique, as other religions are unique or other people are quite unique. And that means often it will eschew labels or boundaries and things like that. And I think that's a fantastic thing. You know, we can't fully label what Judaism is or what Jewish people are, but we know we are Jewish because we are Jewish, you know, because we identify as Jewish. And I think that's really important. So kind of, I don't know, maybe arguing over whether we're a religion or a nationality or a people or an ethnicity, to me, I don't think that has actually a tangible impact on what Judaism is. I think labels kind of help you understand concepts, but at a certain point, you know, if they don't do that, then how much worth do they actually have? So I guess those are my thoughts on that one.
David Knoll writes into us. He says, I think of one of our Temple Sinai board members who happens to be Black and Jewish and a Zionist. She sees herself as Jewish. Can we not just condemn identity politics outright?
Ooh.
Yeah.
David Knoll always coming with a spicy question. I love it. I think, I don't know, Australia has this weird phenomena that I think like we call history wars, we call culture wars. And I'm sorry if that's like an unfamiliar term to a lot of people listening. But it makes me think of that. I think the idea of identity politics, that's something that's become problematic, is really fascinating to me, because at the end of the day, identity politics at its core understands that because of who you are, because of your experiences, you know, growing up and when you walk around the street, affects your values and affects the way that you see the world. So in order to like effectively engage in, you know, political and public life, whatever you want to call it, especially with people who are different to us, we have to understand that their identities mean that they've experienced different things to us. And in that way, I think identity politics is crucial because it helps us understand each other on a deeper level. And I don't think we should conflate identity politics with like factional politics, because those are quite different. That's my thought. That's my response to that question. Not quite answering your question, David, I'm sorry, but that's my thought.
Well, I take it, I mean, if the question is, can we not just condemn identity?
No.
Politics, your answer is probably no.
No.
As I expected, it probably would be.
Probably, yeah.
To me, I think it's a really interesting question, because I think it taps into a lot of what people are arguing right now around the world. And I think what we actually have to understand is identity is just one aspect of, you know, a political discussion and also understanding people in general. I think there's some people who want to sweep it away completely and say it's not relevant at all. And I think that's incorrect. And there's some people who say, well, this is the only thing that's relevant. You know, you're basically defined by attributes you can't control. And I think that's incorrect as well. I mean, ultimately, I believe in the individual. I believe everyone's unique and different, and they're affected by a whole range of attributes as well as, you know, as well as the things they can control and can't control. So I think it is broadly unhelpful to distill people down just to a few things about their identity. But if we can use those things to understand individuals in a positive way, then they're helpful as well. So I guess to try and take the center road on this one, and try and make everyone happy, I think we have to understand the limitations of identity politics, but to completely dismiss and say, you know, someone's background is completely unhelpful in understanding their views or how they grew up, I think that's also somewhat disingenuous as well.
Yeah, I'd like to take a middle ground as well, but a middle ground that's really bothered by kind of both sides of the coin, because I guess that I've engaged a lot with this discussion recently. I'm not sure why, but I think sometimes I get too involved with Sam Harrison. He always harps on about this. But yeah, I would say that there's something that kind of feels like a little bit patriarchal about it. It's like kind of trying to reclaim other people's stories and saying we need to have discussions based only on facts and not based on your experiences, like Jess said, which is a fair point sometimes. And I think that that's the other side of the coin, where the other side of the coin goes so wrong, is when you can only talk about things, you know, if you look a certain way, and sometimes you'll be kind of demonized for privilege and that sort of thing. And I think that does exist. I think talking about that too much kind of takes away from the real issues of racism and sexism and whatever, and instead deflects it onto, oh, well, you care too much because of identity politics. But I still think that it is a problem when kind of only certain people are allowed to talk about certain things and think certain things and represent certain issues, I'd say. But then on the other hand, I mean, kind of, isn't storytelling the best way to teach? And your own story is the best way to express an idea and a notion and a politics. So yeah, I think that there's a lack of kind of being really sure of our facts when we engage in identity politics, and instead kind of going all the way to the storytelling approach. But yeah, I think that kind of basing what you're saying on your own experiences, and what I'd say is, yeah, storytelling is beautiful, and we shouldn't condemn that. Yeah.
Well, speaking of actually storytelling, this week's Australian Jewish News detailed some serious concerns of women in Jewish communal organisations, ranging from exclusion and bad language to, you know, outright sexual harassment. How do we fix a culture that is largely, and I say this, you know, with love for all of the men in these communal organisations, but is largely male, pale, and a bit stale?
I actually didn't read what you just referenced. So,
right.
Yeah.
So there was it was an investigation. The Jewish News surveyed about 111, I think, women working in Jewish communal organizations, and the findings were pretty concerning. There was, from memory, a woman who got treated pretty poorly after telling her work that she was pregnant. She was going to have to take maternity leave. There were stories about, you know, even just from the most basic things of women being expected as staff to, you know, clear up after events, and men, you know, being expected not to. How do we kind of usher in a cultural shift on this?
Yeah, well, that is a good kind of segue from the conversation on storytelling, because I probably have quite a few experiences that I can share. Although Yeah, I feel like I even know that woman, the maternity leave story. But yeah, I think that it's a huge problem. But again, maybe going back to we don't always zoom out and look at the facts. I don't know if it's a worse problem. Like, women get treated pretty badly, or so I hear, in the workforce, and in a lot of different spaces. So I don't know if we as Jews are kind of worse at it. But maybe. I mean, I come from a pretty Orthodox community, and so like the kind of issues that I'm dealing with, or I guess I've kind of been involved in this new organisation, well, new to Australia, that we're setting up. Watch this space. But those issues that we're dealing with are like, you know, mechitza and women showing up to shul, and women being on boards of shuls, and women being allowed to lane and to pray and to lead the praying and read from the Torah. And to others, that's like completely foreign. They're like not engaging in that sort of feminism at all. And it might seem too archaic to even be considered feminism for some people. But to me, it's so important because it's like who I am, and for women to be allowed in those spaces is so important for me. But yeah, I've also been in kind of other mainstream Jewish organizations, and I think that there's certainly implicit, or if not explicit, sexism. And there's been comments made to me, and yeah, it's definitely a problem, but I'd like to also acknowledge the progress. There's a lot of women represented in Jewish organizations, and a lot of organizations have signed the pledge to ensure that there's equality on their boards and that sort of thing. So yeah, we're getting somewhere.
I'll shamelessly note that AUJS did that at the end of last year, but anyway, yes, Jess, go for it.
Yeah, I think if I'm talking about storytelling, almost I won't say almost, every single woman I know has an experience of sexual harassment. Every woman I know has experienced sexism in some form or the other. So naturally it's going to happen within the Jewish community, right? Like, the fact that everyone was surprised to hear about it was very strange. It's like, what do we think the difference is here? So yeah, I can say from my experiences, like, I've definitely felt more unsafe, you know, working in hospitality when old guys get really drunk and are inappropriate to me than I do in my synagogue. But when I do experience in my synagogue, it hurts me a lot more because, like, this is my home. This is where I'm meant to feel safe and be able to engage in prayer and engage with my community. So yeah, like, it hits you in a really different way. And yeah, I can't see the chat, but if anyone else wants to share their story, I'd be really like open to hearing it. I really value people sharing. But yeah, like, maybe the opposite end of the spectrum from Chaya, like, you know, grew up in the progressive community, and I think there's a lot of myth that the progressive community has fixed sexism because women can become rabbis, you know, like, I think, and in that way it can become a little bit tokenistic and we can feel like we finished the work. But I think if, you know, to use Josh's turn of phrase, if the male pale and stale guys up in power took the time to, like, listen to women and their experiences in Jewish communities and institutions across our religious and political spectrum, we'd realize that we have a lot of work left to do. I don't know how to fix it. If we had the answer on this panel to fix sexism, huge.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Yeah. So I guess I guess I kind of see it as definitely a generational thing. I think maybe that's slightly unfair, but I think there's definitely a lot of difference between, I guess, younger community organizations and older ones. So, you know, youth movements, AUJS, AZYC, they tend to have, I think, better female representation than some of the older ones. And I think naturally, as young members of the Jewish community do get older and do get into the ZFA and ECAJ, and I'm not picking on particular organizations, I'm just saying organizations that tend to have older representatives, I think we will see a cultural change. I don't think that's going to fix all of the problems that you guys have listed. It won't. But I do think we'll see significant changes, because we already see, substantial differences between younger community organisations and older ones in terms of representation, particularly.
I just want to respond to that and challenge it a little bit. It's great that all four of us are involved in like Jewish youth spaces in some way or another. But yeah, like obviously there's still sexism in our Jewish spaces. Like as a former leader in a youth movement, I was constantly spoken over by my male colleagues. I constantly had a situation where, male colleagues were getting recognition for my work. I was always the one to be told to take care of the crying kid, because obviously I'm a woman, so I'm more caring, like obvious. And then on a bit more of a serious end, like felt quite intimidated by, male leadership in our community, excluded from a boys club, which can form very quickly in a lot of these organizations. So yes, like generationally, there is a divide, and there is like a cultural divide in our community, and yes, let's recognize it. But I don't want all of our youth spaces to feel like we've got it done.
I think to Jess's point as well, and to slightly think a bit more on Daniel's point, I've had that thought as well, that surely, because I, as a young male Jewish leader, have seen so many phenomenal young women leading in organizations that I'm part of, have sometimes rested on that idea of, well, these amazing women that I'm leading with at the moment are surely going to be, the ones staffing our community organizations, the ones leading our community organizations in 10 to 15 years' time. And then when you look back at who was leading, 10 to 15 years ago, it's definitely the men who are progressing through the communal organizational kind of structure, and women who aren't as much. It's not as frequent, and it's not as common. So I think it definitely requires those men who are now leading, obviously not a panacea, but it definitely requires those men who are now leading to be mentoring young women, to be giving them the kind of support that they need to thrive, and also just to actively have a mindset of the person who comes after me can and should be a woman. I know that I have, for the whole duration of my tenure, actually described, and to the irritation of some of my predecessors, described the person who comes after me as a woman. And it's an intention, and it's not enough. But I don't think we in our community often articulate leadership very well in a manner that and I recognize that there are a lot of incredible women leading at the moment, from our ECAJ president, Zionism Victoria president. We've got fantastic women in staff. I know at AUJS we've got an incredible female CEO. So it's not a one size fits all situation, but I do think those kind of things definitely make an impact.
And it's not like a titles game, right? Like it's not, let's hold up a list of how many women are the presidents and how many men are presidents, right? It's like, again, it's hard for women to become CEOs because the culture of our workplaces and our institutions is more suited to men. So again, I think, I don't know, like I got held up as like, oh, she was a federal masquerade, like look at the women in these positions and stuff. And that's really important. And again, but I just think a caveat to what you're saying, Josh, is like, we need to look inward at the way that we run our institutions. Why aren't women being elected into these positions? And yeah, like the pipeline, 100%. And then also thinking a bit more like structural and cultural changes.
Definitely. And although I would add that I have been in events in our community where there were more men named David than there were women in the audience. So something to genuinely I have. Unless anyone else wants to jump in on that topic, we can move to something else.
Just one tiny thing, which might be stating the obvious, but it's, I think, kind of important maybe to say here, which is that I think, especially the spaces I've been in, even where women are well represented, there's still huge problems in terms of like Jess said, the way that people view that leadership, you know, that it needs to be motherly or whatever, for better or for worse. But as well that, because in different spaces I've been in, there's always that discussion like, and I believe in quotas and affirmative action to the extent that it facilitates women coming to those positions, but then it needs to be so much more, there needs to be so much more work done on the institution itself to make sure that those spaces are comfortable and that women want to be stepping up to those positions and won't be harassed and won't feel alienated. And yeah, I mean, the amount of women who were described over the course of, you know, the past 5 years to me as bossy, and I just made these simple parallels, and I'm like, oh well, I actually think she's really similar to this guy who you've never described as bossy, or you've never described as kind of like difficult to work with or controlling. I think that's still a huge problem. I don't think it's a Jewish problem, but it's a huge problem wherever we are, and no matter whether or not women are well represented. So
definitely. On a completely different topic, a lot of people suggest that it's hard to be a vocal Zionist at our age in today's political climate. Do you think that's true? Daniel, you're nodding.
Yeah, it's super hard. It's really, really hard. And it's really hard for me. And I consider myself like quite informed and quite political and quite involved. And, you know, like I work in politics, you know, my role in byAUJS is all about politics. I help students tackle issues of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism on campus. And I still find it really, really hard to say, you know, to people who aren't Zionists, who aren't Jewish, that I'm a Zionist, because it comes with labels. It comes with, I guess, assumptions about what that means to them. And it's really scary as well, because the last thing you want to do is be judged or have someone make assumptions about you and who you are and what you believe in. And I think, particularly on campus, because that's what I have to deal with, it's really difficult because there is a culture on campus that is not friendly to people calling themselves Zionists. The term Zionism comes with a lot of baggage on campus. A lot of people make a lot of assumptions of what that means, and there's a negative culture. And I also think generally, particularly people who went to Jewish schools, maybe less so public schools, I couldn't tell you, but particularly those with Jewish schools, they've grown up in an environment where being a Zionist is taken for granted, and everyone around them is a Zionist. So when they go into campus, when they go into circles that aren't filled with other Jews and aren't filled with other Zionists, they really struggle, and they really struggle to express that. And I think that's really, really concerning. Zionism is such a significant part of who I am. It's a significant part of how I understand my Judaism as well. So I think it's really, really, really upsetting that us as young people, and I couldn't speak for older people as well, are really struggling to express that to people who aren't Jewish and explain it and say, you know, this is my Zionism, this is why it's important, this is why it's connected to my Judaism as well. And I don't think that's limited to me, because I experience a lot of people, I talk to a lot of people who have the exact same issues. And I think it's a really difficult issue to solve, really.
Yeah, I appreciate, kind of admitting that it is uncomfortable. And I think that for me, it's probably also uncomfortable, although maybe less obvious. I would say that my Judaism is foremost religious, more than I am a Zionist, probably. And I am a Zionist, and so maybe it's a problem that I don't really kind of identify myself in that way to, you know, people at university. It's not the first thing that I'll say. I'll say I'm Jewish, sometimes with some apprehension, depending on the context, but I usually won't introduce myself as a Zionist. And there's kind of something uncomfortable in that, and we all have to kind of look into ourselves and think about why. But I think that there is an answer to the why, or at least to some extent an answer to the why, and that is because of the label. It's such a, it has such a homogenous meaning when, and I really appreciated this in the AZYC, in the plurality of the youth movements, Zionism means so many different things. And people have really complicated relationships with Israel, and you can't put that on a poster, and you can't express that to a university friend in a really quick conversation about Palestine, you know, in a 5-minute conversation. You want to be able to say, I'm a Zionist, but but you can't always. And so that, I think that's why we get uncomfortable with bringing it up in the first place. And yeah, I definitely think it's a problem that we can't have those complex conversations, or we're scared to have the complex conversations. But maybe it's because we're not equipped. You say these people grew up in Zionist schools, but Israel advocacy centers around talking about how Israel is negatively portrayed in the media and how Israel is overrepresented in the UN, in the General Assembly. But then we don't go on to say, well, okay, maybe we're not worse than Syria, but why are we bad to that extent? Like, why are we mentioned in the GA to begin with? And how do we respond to that? And how can we be or la goyim? I mean, if you're in a school that's preaching Zionism, surely there's something special about the country that we need to be able to, and extremely meaningful that we need to be able to express to other people in order to be confident about our Zionism. And that's really hard for people coming straight out of schools where they aren't exposed to people who don't think like them, and especially to people who maybe have never heard anything about Israel and only understand it from the way that it's portrayed in the media. So.
Yeah, yes, it's hard. Yes, it's complicated. Yes, it changes all the time. Short answer. And for me, like, whenever I'm asked this question, like, my go-to response is, look, at the end of the day, as a progressive Jew, I have more rights here as a Jewish person than I do in Israel. And that's very, very hard. That's very hard for me to want to, like, make aliyah to a country where I wouldn't be able to get ordained as a rabbi, where I wouldn't be able to get married in a progressive church and have that marriage be recognized by the state, where you know, reform conversion isn't recognized. That I feel that complication and that tension in my body, like, very, very deeply. And at least in my time talking to other progressive Jews, like, it kind of comes back to that like, it's very hard to, you know, root 100% for a country that doesn't see you as, like, a full person, as a full Jewish person. And I think for me, like, the conversation about, you know, like, classism in Israel and, like, sociopolitics in Israel, especially towards refugees, and then the occupation as well. For me, those are a lot more theoretical. They're a lot more just, like, academic discussions that I'd have with people. The thing I think I feel in my body a lot more deeply is like, my rights to be Jewish in the way I want to be in a Jewish state, and how the current government doesn't let me do that. So that for me is, like, the core of why I'm finding it complicated.
Just to kind of go into touch on what Chaya said, particularly, I think you're 100% right. And a huge reason why young Jews struggle to speak about Zionism in Israel to other people who aren't Jewish or don't share their views is because Jewish schools in particular, I don't think, teach Israel particularly well. You're 100% right. They teach it as advocacy, which is actually not helpful at all, because when Jewish students graduate and have to discuss Israel and they're confronted by things that maybe are uncomfortable or difficult, or issues that Israel has to contend with, like any other society in the world has to contend with, they're not equipped because they haven't had that discussion. So I think what's really important is that Jewish schools teach Israel warts and all. They teach, you know, the contemporary issues that Israeli society is going through, like any other country. And I think that's what we have to highlight, is that Israel is not unique in that sense. It has its own issues. It has its own problems. It's trying to reconcile being both a Jewish state and a liberal democracy and all these issues. And they're super interesting, engaging. But simply dismissing it as, you know, just talking about the UN and the UN's bias, which it totally has, I think is really unhelpful in the long term for Jewish students' ability to actually discuss Israel and discuss their Zionism.
And even to learn more about it as well, like opening up a conversation for us to learn more about Israel and learn more about, you know, Zionist opportunities and things like that. Yeah, I totally agree. I went to a Jewish school, and yes, 100%, that was my experience.
Yeah, I had one teacher. I had one teacher who was fantastic, who really made an effort of really trying to discuss contemporary issues in Israeli society. And that was like one thing that she was really passionate about, and that was fantastic. And I felt like I learned so much from that class. But if students didn't have that class or whatever, I mean, they're really leaving Jewish schools unequipped. And I think that's really worrying, especially when, you put your kids into Jewish schools to learn about Israel and be able to talk about it.
Do you think parents who are sending their kids to Jewish schools are likely going to want that kind of image portrayed of what Zionism is and of what Israel is? I mean, I'm a Jewish school graduate as well, and I definitely would have appreciated a little bit more of a warts and all approach. But do we think that parents are really sending their kids to Jewish schools in order to get that?
I think it's just, there's so much unfair criticism of Israel that we're scared to talk about some of the valid criticism, and that shouldn't be the case. I think we kind of dismiss all criticism as unfair because so much of it is, and so much of it actually is. But like I said, we're really doing the next generation disservice when we don't give them a full education about Israel. Because ultimately, you want young Jewish people to be equipped to speak about Israel, to advocate about Israel, to be passionate about Israel. And the issue with not giving a full education about Israel and treating Israel or discussing Israel like you would maybe discuss any other country in terms of its issues is that if you go to Israel and you don't go in a program like I did, or not a specific program like, my friends who did IBC or Limud or a B'nai program or whatever, you really have to contend with all these issues firsthand, and they don't match up with what you've necessarily been taught in high school. Like when I went on Shinat for a year, I found a lot of issues, cultural issues, really, really difficult in Israel. It's culturally very different to Australia, and that's absolutely fine. But because I wasn't taught to expect that, because I was taught kind of this like crazy utopic understanding of Israel, I wasn't really able to equip with that and reconcile what I was seeing with what I learned. And I think that was a huge issue for me. And overall, it really contributed to my experience in Israel. Overwhelmingly, it was positive, but I think it could have been a lot more positive if I was given a full education about Israel when I was in high school.
Yeah, I think our community has this weird obsession of airing out our dirty laundry, and what I kind of mean by that is sometimes when push comes to shove, yes, we do need to present a united front, for want of a better term, like to the goyim, let's say, but a lot I can't believe I used the word goyim in the ZFA panel. What are we doing? But yeah, again, it's like we're all saying, like, Zionism for each person and each, congregation is so deeply different. And it's the same with our Judaism, and it's the same with how those two things intersect. I think we'd be doing our community and our young people a service to really acknowledge to, let's say, like the Goyim world, the outside world, that these complexities do exist, that yes, we spend an hour on our Sunday night talking about how it's hard to be a Zionist. Like, this is something that we're wrestling with too. Like, I think it's okay for us to present that complexity and that the nuances more openly, exactly like you guys are saying, in our schools, on campus, in multicultural settings and things like that. I think it would help us a lot more.
Yeah. We have to have more faith that young people can understand nuance, essentially, and understand like complicated discussions and issues. We really do.
Chaya, did you want to jump in before we...
No, yeah, I agreed with that little back and forth, and especially that last thing that you said, Daniel, that I think to represent myself, I was only interested in the things that were a little bit more complicated, It's like we are, because we're exposed to so much, especially with this social media age, and we're taught in VC English, not to believe everything that the journalists write, and to think critically and that sort of thing. So we're kind of on the hunt to question things. And if you're offering us something single-sided, we're probably going to be a little bit skeptical of that. And if you don't offer us, or I won't say us, young people, like younger people, a more complex version of that, they'll probably just disengage from it completely. So yeah, and I will also say that there's Zionism and a complicated picture of Israel, and then a whole Jewish/Zionist identities, which, like some communities, some schools, you know, religious or cultural, are better at maybe kind of, yeah, helping young people find the things that are relevant to them. It can't always be, what do we think about that faraway country, Israel? Like, that's a really important discussion because it's key to our identity. But it can't be like we're in the wrong place. Like, it shouldn't always be like, you're a Zionist, but you don't live in Israel, so you can't really be a Zionist, and that's the sum total of your Jewish identity. I'm not saying your Jewish identity can't primarily be Zionism, but it's got to be a, if you are living in the diaspora, it's got to be a diaspora Zionism, in the sense that, yeah, if it's always about how Israel's so complicated and what we can do, well, we can't do all that much because we're not there. And so maybe schools, which I do think that they do think about this, and especially youth movements, we have to think about like our Jewish identities holistically in order to engage young people.
Well, just coming in on the chat, Helen Shardy very nicely says, you are also refreshingly realistic.
Former member for Caulfield, Helen Shardy.
And David Knoll actually asked, do you have talking about Israel training in Victoria? Zionism Victoria does actually run sessions on talking about Israel south of the border, I know. So there is a lot of that available, but we do appear to have a hand up from Paulette Cherney. Hi Paulette. I think she'll be jumping in.
I just wanted to say how articulate you three are. You, Josh, I know. You, Daniel, I know. But I don't know Jess and Chaya. And I'm so impressed with the conversation going on. I'd like you all to join WITSO, by the way, because we need more people like you to help organisations like us to achieve what you're looking for in the community. So very, very impressed. It was an accident, but now I put my hand up. I'm really happy I had the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Well, thanks for jumping in, Paulette. That kind of real-time feedback. You don't get it anywhere else. We might move on to another question. We talked a little bit about Jewish schools before. Fees are going up. We're seeing it become more and more difficult to get kids into Jewish schools. We're kind of the next generation of Jewish parents. Do you think the model is sustainable? And we're almost the current generation of Jewish parents. Don't even get me started. Do we think the current model is sustainable? And I guess, would you send your children to a Jewish school the way that the system works now?
No, the current model isn't sustainable. Jewish people have in Australia, we have a very complicated relationship to class and relationship to income. We have a very complicated relationship with our immigrant stories and all of those different things. So that's my caveat for all of this stuff. You know, where Jewish people live is changing. The types of incomes that Jewish people are receiving is changing. Our economic structure as our community is changing. Our institutions are running out of money. It's not just fees going up. You know, we're struggling to afford shlichim in Australia for the youth movements because our relationship with money and is changing. So it's only natural that we rethink our reliance on expensive private school education. So yeah, I think no, the answer isn't to get rid of Jewish schools and send your kids to youth movements. Those two places achieve very different things. Like, I personally feel like I got the best of both worlds from those two. So no, the answer isn't just like you know, Dafka getting rid of Jewish schools. But again, like the question whether or not I would send my kids to a Jewish school, look, I'm not going to get a law degree or a medicine degree, probably not going to be able to afford it, you know? So I have to seek out Jewishness in other situations. Yeah, I think our community needs to do better in all facets of what we do to make it more accessible to people with lower incomes. Because why is it that a Jewish education and Jewish worship in a synagogue is only for, you know, upper middle people who can afford to? That's not our values. That's not what those are there for. So I don't know if there's any principals of Jewish schools listening, but let's talk scholarships.
Yeah, so let's take a moment to celebrate our youth movements and BYAUJS and kind of the spaces where people can learn about Judaism and Israel for free. And yeah, that's really cool. And I'm sure there are so many incredible testimonies coming out of that. But to Jewish schools and their value and their place. I don't know what I'll do with my kids, but I personally went to Beth Rivka, which is a Chabad school, but possibly about 20% of my class were actually Chabad, myself included. And well, my mum's now on the board of Beth Rivka, and she's like on the front lines of working out fees and stuff. But the reason there were so many students who weren't Chabad, but went to Beth Rivka is because it is the cheapest Jewish school in Victoria. And there was something really special about that growing up. My class was pretty diverse. There were definitely students there that were more secular than students in some of the other Jewish schools. And a lot of immigrant families send their kids there as well. There are a lot of students that have Russian backgrounds, Israeli backgrounds. Yeah, so that's really nice. I think that there's definitely a compromise when fees are less expensive, but maybe schools need to kind of think about what they're offering and what they can offer for less money, and where their values are, and kind of what's really important, and if a swimming pool is as important as inclusion. I'm not saying, yeah, I'm not, I don't know, because like I've never thought so much about fees, and thank God I've never had to really worry about it. But the world is changing, and surely people are changing their minds as to how important it is to send their kids to Jewish schools. And if we value students or Jewish children hanging out with other Jewish children and learning about their Jewish identities, then something's got to give.
Yeah, look, I would say first up, I had a really positive experience going to a Jewish school. I really enjoyed it. I had a great time. I feel like I took a lot out of it. So overwhelmingly, I thought it was really positive, and I really hope other people also get to have that experience as well. I mean, I would say I was speaking to one of my friends recently, and he was quite honest in saying that living in the Jewish community is expensive, and it means you have to compromise on other aspects of your life. If you want to pursue a career that's creative or something that isn't, isn't in finance or something that comes with a lot of money, then you actually have to compromise on a lot of things that you might hold a lot of value to. So like living in a particular area, like if you're in Melbourne, living in Caulfield, for example, or the equivalent suburbs in Sydney, or, going to a particular school. And if you think those things are important, then essentially that's going to govern all the rest of your life decisions, because in order to provide those things, you're going to have to make certain compromises and certain decisions in terms of how you live your life. And that's really difficult because, I mean, maybe I'm lucky to be passionate about something that, law, I guess, you could get a fairly good income out of it. But a lot of people are passionate about different other things, and they really should be able to follow those passions as well. I think, yeah, overall living in the Jewish community is really expensive. And I mean, we all know it's not sustainable. And every single panel that we ever have on any issue, we always talk about school fees. We always talk about how expensive it is in the Jewish community. And I think that highlights how difficult of an issue it really is. I don't think we've found an answer. I don't think we're going to find it here tonight, but it really is the most concerning thing, because, I mean, all of us, I guess, went to Jewish schools and we had that, but chances are a lot of people in the next generation aren't, various different reasons, cultural, financial, etc. And the Jewish community is going to change because of that. So I guess if the Jewish community feels that young Jewish people going to Jewish schools really is a priority. And something does have to change, and we have to make sure it is a priority, because as it currently stands, that's just not going to happen.
I also just want to mention the flip side of what Daniel's saying, or the other side of that, which is that besides for making Jewish schools more affordable for the obvious reasons, so that people can afford it and it can be more inclusive, there's also definitely a negative culture that comes along with only high-income families being able to go to certain schools, and it naturally creates a hierarchy, and it also naturally creates, and this is where our stage of life, we've really noticed this, a serious pressure, as has been said, to opt for certain careers over other careers, and really kind of worry about money, which, shouldn't be a Jewish value so much, and maybe we as a community can think about ways to change the impression we're giving young people about what it means to be Jewish. Being Jewish doesn't mean being rich. And so we have to really be careful about how that comes across to other people and to younger people.
And even like going to, again, like I went to a Jewish school, and I'm sure it's quite similar. Maybe you guys have similar experiences, but when you grow up in an environment only surrounded by one type of person with one type of background, especially in terms of their relationship to money, as in you just go to school and all of your friends are like wealthy people, that doesn't equip you very well for life. Like it's important for us to grow up with diverse people and diverse experiences. And like our Jewish community will be stronger. Diversity makes us stronger every single time. And the research and the stories prove this time and time again that, I just agree. Yeah, I agree with everything everyone said.
I'm conscious that we've only got a few minutes left. And I know this is going to be a bit of an ask, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this question as quickly as you can, if possible. Organisations like byAUJS and youth movements are seeing declines in participation, leaders, and in particular in participation on trips to Israel. How do we continue to engage people in our demographic with their Jewish identity in this new landscape, do you think? It's a big one. Sorry, I saved it for the end.
I can put youth movement hat on very quickly to answer this, and again, don't quote me on this because it's so complicated.
No one can see this, don't worry.
Right. The first thing to say is like, no, not all youth organizations are experiencing declining membership. Some are experiencing a growth in membership. And there might be a decline in participation in Israel programs. And from my experiences, the two main reasons that a kid who's grown up in a youth movement doesn't go to Israel is there isn't adequate mental health support on these programs, so they don't feel safe going. And the second is, it is so expensive. So it just links back into a lot of things that we've spoken about before. But yeah, just injecting that in there. I think there is a bit of a myth of all of this stuff is in decline. Well, let's just like break it up into individual organizations, and the numbers aren't in decline overall for everyone.
Yeah, and I think, I guess, putting on my AZYC hat with the caveat that I have been out of there for 2 years and things have changed, and that's so important as well, because we kind of flap our wings whenever there is a decline, and then a couple of years later it spikes up again. So yeah, we don't have a good macroscopic understanding of what's really going on with SHNUT numbers, and we don't always have to be so doomsday about it. Youth movements are one of the oldest kind of organizations that we have around, so I'm confident that they'll survive some hurdles. But yeah, definitely I would say that at the base of this is, besides for so many other things, but at the base of this is affordability and priorities, because affordability always comes along with priorities. And we as a community should really think about, and I would really advocate for us to think about why SHNUT is so important, and possibly why it's more important than, going back to our older conversation about Israel's complexity, than a really short trip to Israel that kind of celebrates Israel and, you know, sings about its all its glory. Whereas youth movement Shnut programs and other Shnut programs, I believe, are much more complex, partly because they're longer, and so you actually kind of can immerse yourself and think about where you are and how different it is to your expectations. And so if we as a community can prioritize it more, then maybe we can also pump more money into it, and it can be more affordable for the individual.
Daniel, very quickly, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Yeah, I'll end with something somewhat controversial. I 100% agree with Chaya and Jess in terms of affordability. I think that's a huge issue, but I also think year 10 programs are really problematic in terms of Shnut. People who go on a year 10 Israel program are not going to go on a gap year to Israel. And I think the experience that someone has when they're 18, when they're an adult in Israel and going there somewhat independently is very different to what you would experience in a school trip when you're 15 and 16. So I think if you want people to have a quality Israel experience, I think we should be prioritizing Shnut over year 10 programs.
And Shnut is also a leadership program. It's not just like an Israel experience. Yeah.
And on that note, thank you so much to our guests tonight, to Daniel, to Jess, to Chaya. It's a fantastic discussion. I almost feel like half of a participant, half a fly on the wall for it. I'll throw back to Bren now, who will take us out this evening.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, everyone. That was a fantastic panel discussion. I think we received the unvarnished opinions of our next generation. I think they've laid down a challenge in numerous issues such as gender balance, such as Jewish education, Zionist education. And look, if you for those of us who sadly can no longer call ourselves young, if you don't agree with what the panel tonight said, I think yes, they've laid down a challenge, but I think they've got fairly open lines of communication. So, this is a great opportunity for us. We've heard from them. I'm sure that they'll hear from you over the coming days and weeks. Keep the conversation going. Keep the conversation going also on Facebook if you're joining us through that. Thank you, everyone else. Just a reminder, next week we will be here again at 8 p.m. I'll be talking with Zeddy Lawrence, the editor of the Australian Jewish News. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a good week.